Okay. Okay.
In 5, 4, rock, paper, scissors. Take a deep breath. Go.
Hello, everybody, and welcome to Ramona Speaks the Other Truth. And tonight, my guest is Catherine Chazin. She has a bachelor's in history from UCLA and is an independent scholar who has studied the Shakespeare authorship question since 1985. So this is not something that she just jumped on board. She has edited letters and poems of Edward, Earl of Oxford, contributed to Contested Year in 2016, and has written several articles in Oxfordian publications. And she's going to also tell us about the Shakespeare Oxford Fellowship Conference in October. Welcome, Catherine.
Thank you, Ramona. Great to be here.
Nice to meet you, finally. And this is her book, everyone. And I suggest if you are a Shakespeare person, English literature major, I suggest you go out and take a look at this, and especially you thespians out there. There's a lot to learn about Mr. William. And let's get started, because I want to know, when did the questions first come up regarding this mystery?
Yes, the first books started coming out in the mid 1800s. It was, people were pointing to Francis Bacon as the great author. And the main reason was because he had such incredible education. He was a lawyer, he was a diplomat, he knew all the sciences and wrote a huge body of work. It was very learned. And so they naturally thought, gee, this could be a match. Because as far as we know, the attributed author, the man born in Stratford-on-Avon in 1564, we don't have any knowledge of his education.
And why did they assume it was him? Because there's like no personal notes, no nothing. So where did they get that it was him?
That it was the Stratford man.
Right.
Yes, yes. Well, we can jump into that right now. And it's all because of this book with that famous face.
Oh,
this is the opening pages. They call it the first folio because of the large size. And first because there were 4 total that were published over a number of years. And this is the complete, not the complete, but a collection of 36 Shakespeare plays. And it was one of the greatest moments in literature. If we didn't have this book, we wouldn't have had plays like Macbeth,
right,
and many others. There were 17 plays, brand new to the world, printed for the first time in this book. So this is a great event. And in the opening pages to this book, the preface, we have some praise of the great author Shakespeare. And in one of the poems, and of course they mention that he has died, he is now dead. So one of the tributes to him contains the phrase, "Sweet Swan of Avon." Okay, so Avon, the Stratford man was born in Stratford-on-Avon, right? So we have Avon. And then you go a few pages later, there's another poem with a reference to Shakespeare's Stratford Monument. And so you have Stratford. So Shakespeare, Stratford, and Avon all together in one book, but not on the same page, not the same phrase. And that is really what pointed the direction of the Shakespeare authorship to Stratford-on-Avon, because in fact, there is a monument to Shakespeare in the local church there. Although we can get into that later if you want, the monument is not the same today as it was, 400 years ago. So anyway, that is primarily it. If you look at these 16 opening pages before all the plays are printed, there's no sense of biography whatsoever. There's no mention about his life, his wife, children, education, nothing. All we have is this face, that famous black and white face, and he's not even portrayed with a book or with a pen or the other accoutrements of a writer that you would expect. He's just really a portrait of a 17th century gentleman. That's basically all you have here. And so that is a problem. When you open up to the next page, we have, this is a dedication to the Earls of Pembroke and Montgomery. They're two brothers. Their titles were Earl. And we have a letter written by actors named John Hemming and Henry Condell. Now, the problem with this letter, there's many problems, but any Shakespeare professor will tell you that Hemming and Condell did not write this letter, that it was actually written by another contributor in the book, Ben Jonson, who was a famous playwright. So right off the bat, we're starting to get weirdness. No biography, no direct reference to Stratford-on-Avon. And we have, as Mark has noted to me too many times, there are 5 pages that are blank in these opening pages. There's plenty of room to put more about him, but no, it's 0. So this is where it all began, in my opinion, a hoax again, perpetrated against the great author and perpetrated against anybody who loves Shakespeare and the plays.
As I was reading in your book and thinking about it, because first of all, there's so much information in the book, and I guess I've caught myself playing sleuth, because when somebody's name would mention, then I'd have to go and start checking their background and everything, and oh my gosh. But I don't understand why he wasn't so public. It's almost like Jesse James, the only people that knew what he looked like and who he really was were those that were in his inner circle, and none of the public. And
yes.
I don't even understand, because there was nothing in his background, the one that it's all attributed to make him want to shy away from the public just being out there and getting the accolades and stuff. It's just boggles my mind.
Yes, he's curiously absent.
Yes.
Anywhere you would expect to find him. Now, back then, writers of the period, they would talk about each other in their little pamphlets and their works. They would make references, but they never claimed to have known or met Shakespeare while he was alive. They never claimed that. We have no evidence of his schooling. We have no letters in his handwriting. We don't have any diaries. I mean, we have such a thing with many other people of that same period. They exist in libraries today, right? And most oddly of all, when he died, the Stratford man, in 1616, no one said a word about it. None of his fellow poets and playwrights, nobody said a word. So that is, again, very unusual. for the period, almost every other writer of some renown, somebody would mention their passing. Like, for example, Francis
Bacon.
Beaumont. No, actually, I really meant to say another writer of the period, Spenser, Edmund Spenser, in 1599. When he died, there were many tributes within a year of his life. And not only that, he was buried in Westminster Abbey, which was a great honor for anyone to be buried in. And he was given all these accolades. We even have a write-up in a history book of his funeral and what the poets did. They threw their pens into his grave.
Wow.
As a gesture. We don't have any such anecdote or history about the recognized back then greatest one of all, the greatest poet and an author. So this is all very, very strange. And if you added up the cumulative evidence, it all points to the idea, this big zero means the name was someone's pen name, William Shakespeare. And in about half the time the name was printed, it had a hyphen between shake and spear, indicating like a movement, an action, a descriptive action. Actually, spear shaking in this period would be a reference to jousting, which was an old medieval sport that they revived during this period, the Elizabethan period. And many people, usually they were nobility, you had to be very rich to be in a jousting match because of the costume, the armor, the horses, everything. And it's Shakespeare could be a reference to him being a jouster. So all this adds up to the idea of a pen name. And I believe the pen name was the Earl of Oxford's pen name. And the problem is that there was someone born with the name William Shakespeare in Stratford-on-Avon, and he was involved in the theater. So the two got mixed somehow. In my opinion, it was purposeful. Mm-hmm. And that's the last couple chapters of my book. I try to explain why and how this happened. But it's time to bring these facts to light so we can all try and get at the truth. To one of history's, Western civilization's one of the greatest artists.
Wow, and you think about it, that was in 1600s, early 1600s, as a matter of fact, and here we are in 2021. So we're talking 400 years of deception. There's no other term to describe it.
Yes.
And it just, okay. Why? I mean, there were other writers, playwrights or whatever, but were they looked down upon, or was it something that lesser people were involved in? What would be the reason for the anonymity of it?
Yes, that's a great question. As I mentioned, I believe that the great author was a nobleman, the Earl of Oxford. And back then, if you were someone of that high status who was involved in literature, poetry, the theater, that was considered kind of something frivolous. It was something that somebody with a high position like that shouldn't be involved with. And if you were kind of, looked down upon by your peers. So it was something that the great author actually, he didn't want people to know during his lifetime. That may have contributed also to the general silence. However, after he died, it would have been acceptable for a nobleman to get his works printed and with his name on it. Then the stigma is gone. And we have proof of this because there's another poet named Philip Sidney, and he was from a noble, he had noble relations, and he was a well-known poet, but he didn't publish in his lifetime. But after he died, about 5 years later, his own sister, who was a countess, she printed his works. And she even put her name on it as well, you know? So it was perfectly acceptable at that point. But for some reason, some important reason, the Earl of Oxford did not get this credit. And I think it had to do with perhaps politics or maybe satirizations of important people, because the Earl of Oxford, the true author, he was one of the, you know, favorites of Queen Elizabeth I and her court. And I think in a few cases, it's been acknowledged that a few Shakespeare characters were being lampooned in them. And, you know, that could have been a reason, and there could have been other reasons as well. If you'd like, we can get into that at some point. But
yeah, Catherine, what?
Yes.
You just mentioned you think the real author was a nobleman, and you know, we are kind of getting into Sonnet 125. But before we jump into any of the sonnets, what are the differences between the plays and the sonnets, and what's the importance of the sonnets for your theories?
Yeah, the Shakespeare plays, there's about 40, maybe even more than that. And of course, these are fictions, but the sonnets, which was published in 1609, there are 154 poems, 14 lines each, of iambic pentameter. And they're really the great author's personal ruminations and his thoughts about life, about his loves. He had great love and respect for a young man. Today we call him the fair youth. And he also was deeply, deeply smitten by the dark lady of the sonnets. He describes her as someone with dark hair and eyes. So we today call her the dark lady. And so within these sonnets, he really tells us a lot about himself. In a few of them, he mentions, really, he reveals he's a nobleman. I mean, you have to read them carefully. Also that he's a little bit older, kind of nearing death. And also he even alludes to having a pen name. Like, for example, in Sonnet 72, my name be buried where my body is, and live no more, to shame nor me nor you. So he's saying his name is not going to live on after he dies. And so that's a very curious statement. But in the same breath, he says that the fair youth, the young man that he loves, that his name would live on. So how is that possible if he's referring, you know, to the name William Shakespeare? That name has lived on. My point is, his name really hasn't lived on because not his real name. His real name was Edward de Vere, the 17th Earl of Oxford, and William Shakespeare is his pen name. So he's telling us in this sonnet and a few others that it really is a pen name. And as you mentioned in Sonnet 125, he really kind of lets drop that he was a nobleman. If you want to show that picture.
Okay. Harold. There's the Lady Anne Russell's wedding.
Yes, and the lady under the canopy is Queen Elizabeth I, right? And you have all these courtiers that are holding it. And if you look at Sonnet 125, he says, were it aught to me, I bore the canopy, with my extern the outward honoring. So bearing the canopy was just what Mark showed us, holding those poles that are holding up this canopy over the queen. Now, back in this period, for somebody to do that, they have to be someone who has a title at least, or somebody who is an important person would have that privilege. And yet the tone of this sonnet was, did it mean anything to me that I held the canopy? Like, that just doesn't make sense if we're talking about the Stratford man, who was someone of humble origins from a small town with no title, nothing. It would be the greatest honor of his life to have been one of those men holding those poles. But the great author acts as if it's just something else, something I do all the time, no big deal.
You don't see the village blacksmith in there with all the guys with the ruffles and the nice suits and the ruffs around their necks. Just that one sonnet 125 just really seems to indicate that the only person who would be doing that is or would have been a nobleman.
Yes, it's a total disconnect between the author who's writing in the first person about himself and the person born in Stratford-on-Avon. So yeah, and he also uses the term gracious to describe himself. He says in Sonnet 62, "Methinks no face so gracious is as mine." And gracious was a term in the Shakespeare plays used to describe nobility and the royalty of the period. That's who it was, that's what that term describes. It's not like so much today where we think somebody's being very kind and honorable.
Gracious.
It was more of a reference to nobility.
So having said that, why, in your opinion, could it not be Francis Bacon? He seemed like a good candidate to me, because I said, wow, I didn't even know he was even considered until somebody had offhanded mentioned his name. And I said, well, wait a minute. And I looked it up, and he kind of fits a lot of the he's kind of right up there for me.
Well, I agree. He, the early anti-Stratfordians really rallied around Francis Bacon because of his, he had a superlative education and he wrote a huge body of works, but it was mostly more scientific and philosophical.
And it's
kind of hard. It's hard to imagine because Shakespeare wrote a huge body of works too. It's kind of hard to think that one man in one lifetime could do both of these works, huge bodies of works. Also, Francis Bacon was not known as a playwright.
No, but he did have a couple. He used to act them out with his little circle in that inn. I forget what the name of the inn was that he had been sent to while he was doing his legal studies. So I thought that was and so he actually did act some out, and he wasn't ashamed. So that's why I'm saying, so why? And he had a connection temporarily, hit and miss with Queen Elizabeth, more so I think with James the First, right? So I came to the conclusion that maybe it was a group.
Yes, there's some people are in the group theory. It's true.
Oh, okay, yeah, but
that was a good supposition. But yeah, I don't see life parallels between Francis Bacon and events in the plays like you would expect. And also he was known to have written a masque, as far as I know, which is a type of play but he wasn't celebrated in his lifetime for
Right.
being a playwright.
Right.
The Earl of Oxford was, however, which is very interesting. He was recognized as a playwright, but we don't have any plays that have survived, that is, with his name on it. So, but maybe they have
Yeah.
survived with the name William Shakespeare. That's what we think. Yeah, and as far as the group theory goes, some people do believe it. And actually a few Shakespeare plays, one, for example, The Two Noble Kinsmen, the title page says written by Shakespeare and also John Fletcher. So that was the only case where you have a shared authorship on one play. And my take on it is that there was a portion of an early play of Two Noble Kinsmen, and later Mr. Fletcher added to it. That's
Okay.
sort of my, so I think there could be have shared authorship, but I don't think it was while the great author was alive. I think maybe it happened afterwards.
Were they
Because-
paid for those plays? I mean, okay, you write a play, it's being produced. Where are you? At the end of the play, or did you receive any money for it? There's just like no record. How
Exactly.
does that
receipt.
happen?
We do have records for some playwrights. We have one diary of Philip Henslow. He was a theater producer, and in it he mentions paying playwrights
Right.
like £3, £4, something like that for a play. So we have that, but unfortunately, no William Shakespeare in there, and
Wow.
that's one of the great points about the controversy. We don't have any payments to him as a writer in
No.
his lifetime. You
None.
know? All we have is this gentleman named William Shakespeare, and when he was 30 years old, he received a payment for performance along
Right.
with 2 other people. Okay, that's about all we have. And at that point, he was 30 years old, and that's our first theater reference for him.
Yeah.
Later on, we have a reference to him being a member of an acting company. And we also have references to him being a theater shareholder, but no references to writing. Absolutely none.
And
Yeah.
in the book you mentioned, sort of at that time there were 2 William Shakespeares, right? Around
That-
town.
Exactly. Exactly. At the same time, you have this man born with that name,
Right.
and then you also have the great author using a pen name.
Yeah.
So yes, and the 2 just got merged, in my opinion, after both of their deaths.
Yeah.
In this book, that first folio book I showed you, that's where all the hoax began.
Okay. Oh, go ahead,
ahead,
Mark.
Mark.
Okay.
Oh.
Yeah, Catherine, you bring up the great author was disgraced, and the traditional biography of Shakespeare shows that he was busted for deer poaching at Charlotte Park. Did that incident, like being like doing stupid stuff, like kids do at 12, 13, did that follow him throughout his life, or is this disgraced adjective being used more as an adult? Because we do know that Edward de Vere was frequently in trouble with the Queen.
Mhm.
Yes, I think that the legend of deer poaching and the Stratford men, maybe it's true, but I don't think that that's what the great author was referring to. I think he's referring to like a wounded name, perhaps being involved in the theater, which was considered somewhat déclassé back then. And also he sort of degraded his own earldom, the earldom of Oxford. When he inherited the earldom of Oxford, he had, I think, over 100 estates. And when he died, Maybe he had one or two. I mean, he didn't have that many. So history has said that he was a spendthrift and that he ruined his kingdom, his earldom. But maybe all this money was used to fund and give play performances before Queen Elizabeth and to fund other writers to write. And we know the Earl of Oxford sponsored many publications. There's more than 25 book dedications to him of histories, translations, poetry, music, the arts in general. So I think that he didn't squander it. I think he was really enriching the cultural life of England. And I think he also made a few bad investments. So, I mean, part of the disgrace could be, his the degradation of his earldom.
Well, he was thrown in the Tower.
That's another reason. Yes.
Yeah, but then in the Oxfordian volume 23 that just came out too, there's a statement made in there that Queen Elizabeth also gave him a hat on his parole.
Yes.
Yeah, those two had an interesting love-hate relationship.
Yes, in 1581, the Earl of Oxford got one of the Queen's attendants with child, and she gave birth. And as soon as the Queen found out, the three of them were put into the Tower of London, and he was in there for 3 months. And she finally released him. And as Mark said, he gave her from her own wardrobe a hat. We don't know why, but it was given. And it just so happens that there is a painting of him that I found that's on the cover of my book, where he's wearing a hat of the same description at the same time that the painting is dated. So that was a very interesting connection. And the Queen did not allow him back into court for 2 years. So that was another form of disgrace, being separated from the Queen's court. So, but I think that he got a lot of work done, I think, during that period.
It almost sounds like the Queen and Edward should have been guests on Jerry Springer's show.
Really?
Yeah, I mean, it was rumored that the Queen and the Earl of Oxford had an affair. And that's while he was married to his wife. And so even Mary, Queen of Scots, mentioned it in a letter. So, the Earl of Oxford, we only have about 2 biographies of him, but 2 or 3, there certainly is room for more. His life was so fascinating, and there's so many parallels in the plays with him as the character.
Did Queen Elizabeth ever meet William Shakespeare? Is there any record of that meeting?
Absolutely not, and that's very strange. We have 2 plays that were printed while she was alive that said that she viewed these plays. Now, of course, when the Queen viewed these plays, it was not in the theater. It was not at the Globe Theater like Shakespeare in Love would show you. They were in her private castle or palaces, right? They would be private performance. And so I think that these plays were originally written for her. And a great example is in 1577, when the Stratford man was 13 years old, there was a play called A History of Error. And I'm sure you've heard the Comedy of Errors by William Shakespeare, right?
Right.
Well, Orthodox Shakespeareans say, oh, well, this 1577 play, it can't be Shakespeare because Shakespeare was only 13 years old. You know, so they have to discount it. And that's what a lot of their research does. They have to discount things instead of saying, look at where the evidence is leading us. Their evidence is leading us to the idea that the plays were written much earlier than they believe.
Well, what spurred them on in the beginning when they started writing these bogus biographies of him? I mean, without anything to back it up whatsoever. How did it just become the thing, has proof?
Yeah, it's just been, the lies put out by the first folio book. And then not too long later, a couple decades later, there was not much theater put on because of the civil wars in England. So I think, as time passed, people forgot. And also there's a very intriguing phrase in 1640. It was a poem written to William Shakespeare. Of course, he's been dead for many years. And they say, Shakespeare, we must be silent in thy praise. So in 1640, many decades after Shakespeare's death,
Yeah.
people were, it looks like they were forced to be silent about Shakespeare, to not
Right.
talk about him. Yes.
Right.
And I think that silence, it just, in the end, nothing more was written about him. And
It's
the whole
almost
thing
like he
got
was
lost.
blacklisted, like he had committed, something that he was not to be mentioned, and somebody just 100 years later came up with his plays and writings. But the man and the history itself, it's almost like it really was erased off, and they had to come up with something to sell the plays, I guess. Because were they popular during his time in the 1600s, or
They were very popular. Yes.
and that's why it just is, it boggles the mind how our educational system can go forth for hundreds of years with a lie.
Exactly. I think, well, they say, you say a lie long enough, and they say it so many times, it becomes the truth. And I think that's what's happened. And also, a great period of time before the age of biography started. And I think that really started in the 1700s, and they really at that point knew nothing. I mean, it really was kind of a dead issue. And then the people started, trying to get more. We have researchers scouring the area of Stratford-on-Avon for books or manuscripts. They couldn't find anything. They were bankrupt. And it's just so unusual. And it's the wrong spot. That's why they're coming up with nothing. And once we acknowledge that there's a problem here, that there is reason to doubt, then we're going to get lots of new research, in my opinion, with open-minded people. And we're going to find all sorts of things. Maybe we'll even uncover the Shakespeare play manuscripts, which not even one page survives to this day.
Exactly. I was thinking for the beer, I mean, any errors or anything you would think also would come across something. And even in that situation, there was nothing. You would think if he and Elizabeth were lovers, that somebody would find something to connect. And what this all does, what you have brought to my sensibilities, is the fact that, oh my God, I mean, what can we trust going back when you start teaching things that happened so many hundreds years ago. Where's the proof? You know, we just assuming, I mean, like, you know, everybody in my class and the classes before me, you know, studying Shakespeare, you know, and I was in acting, and it was just, you know, it was just something that you just accepted. And
Yes.
then when you try to write about the man, there's not really much on him.
Yes. In fact, Mark Twain, you know, which was a pen
Right.
name for Samuel Clemens, he said, he wrote a book about this in 1909 called Is Shakespeare Dead? This was before the Earl of Oxford was known. And he said that the Stratford man's case is like a reconstructed brontosaur, 9 bones and 600 barrels of plaster of Paris.
Yeah.
That's it. We
Yeah.
just have a few little scraps, and then the rest they've had to fill in, which is not acceptable. You know, it's so funny because so many Shakespeare scholars will tell you that Hamlet was probably the most autobiographical of the plays, right? But if you look at the profile of Hamlet, who was he? He was a
Yeah.
prince. He was a university student. He was a nobleman. He was a courtier. He was a traveler. He killed someone. He patronized an acting company. He was on a ship and pirates attacked him. Okay. Now, none of those can be applied to the Stratford man, as far as we know, right? But they fit perfectly the Earl of Oxford. All those things happened to him, you know, and he was, all right, he wasn't a prince, but he was pretty high up. He was the 17th Earl of Oxford.
Okay.
So, you know,
Well, his stepdad was really high up in the court.
the Earl of Oxford? Or who are
Yeah.
you talking?
Yeah, the Burleys.
Oh, that wasn't his stepfather, his father-in-law.
Okay, I'm
His
sorry.
father-in-law. Yes, the Earl of Oxford's father-in-law was William Cecil, Lord Burleigh. And he really ran the country, you know, next to the Queen. He was
Right.
really the power man. And that was the Earl of Oxford's father-in-law. He married the daughter of Lord Burleigh. And many people historians see one character, Polonius in Hamlet, who was the king's minister. Many see that as a portrayal of Lord Burleigh, and it was not a flattering one either.
Wow.
And by extension, then Ophelia, who was the minister's daughter, would be Anne Cecil, Lord Burleigh's daughter, that the Earl of Oxford married. So how would the Stratford man, number one, know Lord Burleigh to satirize him in a play, and number two, get away with it?
Right.
You know?
Right. Right.
I mean, these plays were publicly performed. In fact, the first edition of Hamlet, it said that it was performed at Oxford University and Cambridge University. So, you know.
And then funny you should mention that, because during that time, man, any kind of little slight that you might make to the royals or whatever meant some kind of action would have been
You go to the
taken
tower.
against you. Yeah. And there's no, I mean, I would think that some of the plays that once they were performed, there would be a raid, and they would take that author and throw him in the dungeon.
Exactly. Many authors, many dramatists
Yeah.
of this period were thrown in the tower.
Right.
Many of them. But
Right.
never happened to William Shakespeare, right? So that's questionable. And especially so because in 1601, a bunch of noblemen got together and tried to take the throne from Elizabeth.
Right.
They call it
Right.
the Essex Rebellion,
Right.
right? And the night before this rebellion happened, his supporters paid for a performance of Richard II. Now, Richard II was a Shakespeare history play, and in it, the king is deposed and also killed.
Mm-hmm.
That is why they performed. They were getting the population kind of primed in the mood to support Queen Elizabeth's downfall. Well, it failed, right? So they questioned some of the actors who put on this performance, and they did not question the author of it.
And that's
That's odd.
raises your eyebrows.
It raises, and he should have been thrown in prison, if he was the author of this play,
There would be some kind of stink in the newspapers or something,
Exactly. Nobody, nothing. So, and also it's very interesting to note that the Earl of Oxford received £1,000 per year from the Queen. So it raises a lot of questions. Why? And in the record of this, it said that he didn't have to make any accounting of what he does with the money. So was it just her being friendly, or was she paying him for compensation for entertaining her all those years with, in my opinion, the Shakespeare plays?
Right.
And also to improve his station, because as I mentioned, he had to sell so many of his properties and estates. And
right.
so,
yeah, because he was always
you add all this up, and it really, really points to him being the author.
Wow. That's just, it kind of makes me angry, in a way, because you think, dang, is there anything, that you can trust? Because 400 years of
credit going to someone else.
Yes. I mean, if you wrote Romeo and Juliet, wouldn't you want to know?
Yeah.
The world to know that?
Yeah.
Or Hamlet,
Yeah.
or those sonnets, which are wonderful, and so it's, it's time to, let's give some simple justice to the great author. And also, what about all the millions of people who love Shakespeare, that read the plays, and they really want to know a little bit more about him? Well, right now, all they have is, fluff. They don't have anything solid. They just have speculation for the most part.
Well,
if you have a real biography to match it with, it's so much more enriching.
Yes, it is.
Well, Catherine, what you just said about having a real biography, it takes me back to your book. When you're presenting a lot of your information about the new personality profile of the real author that emerges from the sonnets. You're saying the Stratford man was 34 when the sonnets were just starting to be published in the early 1590s. And it seems like Shakespeare is just coming out of those lost years, and like all of a sudden he just kind of hits the big time based on just like showing up. But the founder of your movement, the Shakespeare Oxford Fellowship, Looney talks about, I just lost the page, where most world masterpieces are written by older people. 70 masterpieces, however, are the fruits of mature powers. Dante was over 50 years of age. Milton was 55 when he wrote Paradise Lost. Cervantes was 60 when he wrote Don Quixote, so on. Yeah, you're giving us some real biographical information, insights into human nature that someone that young really doesn't have the understanding of the human experience to write as passionately and in-depthly as the great author.
Yes, well, the great author had to have been a child prodigy from day one. I mean, it must have been recognized. And all you have to do is just look at all the subjects the great author knew, you know, all the languages, the modern languages like Italian and French, and he knew Latin and Greek. He knew astronomy, he knew rhetoric. You know, many of these topics were only taught at university level, and some of them nowhere. You had to, you know, go abroad. He had understanding of places in Italy, tiny details that you know, not that you wouldn't just find in a travel book, that type of thing. He knew real details. So he had to have been, his genius had to have been noticed early, and that's just not the case for the Stratford man. For the Earl of Oxford, he was had tutors when he was very young, and you know, under age 10. By age of 8, he went to Cambridge University.
Yeah.
And when he was 12, he went to Oxford University. And then thereafter, he went to law school. And thereafter, he took a grand tour of Europe over a year and a half, almost a year and a half. So, I mean, you have all the interesting life experiences and definitely the intellect to support the depth of the great author. And we also, yeah.
There's a question, someone asked a question, was it a privilege to serve or an obligation for these people?
To serve?
Like the royals, yeah.
I think it was both. I mean, if she named you to a position, that was a great privilege. But also, someone of high status should not be, you know, dabbling in the theater and writing poetry. You should be like a general or a justice or a counselor to the queen. Yeah. That's probably more suitable for somebody of high rank. But I think she recognized his genius, and she also was using his works as maybe a form of propaganda. Like, for example, the play Henry V. It was a very patriotic play, and there's many rousing speeches in there to make you proud that you're English. And it very likely was written a couple years before the Spanish Armada invasion. Okay. So I think that she recognized that we need the country to pull together. And I think that perhaps the great author was involved with that in the form of plays, glorifying England. So, yes.
Now, in the sonnets, for our listeners, did Shakespeare invent the sonnet? Was that his creation for the listeners out there?
No, actually, very interestingly, it was invented by the Earl of Oxford's relative, I believe an uncle. Created, he was, his last name was Howard. He was the Earl of Surrey, and he developed the sonnet, the 14-line sonnet. So it's kind of in the family in a way.
Yeah, because
at least literature, yes, and poetry.
They always call it the Shakespearean sonnets, and we have to write, you know, get Shakespeare's book and look at it and do it all comparatively, you know.
Well,
so
he really perfected it and brought it to, you know, the level of even music. You speak it and it's like music if you speak it aloud. It's very beautiful. Yes.
Yeah, I Catherine, another interesting profile from Shakespeare Identified, it is that Looney writes, and so far as that mysteriousness is concerned, which we attributed to Shakespeare, it must be admitted that the sudden non-appearance of work from such a pen as that of De Vere's is as mysterious as the subsequent appearance of the Shakespeare poems and dramas. He's saying that Oxford was writing, then all of a sudden everything just came to abrupt end, and all of a sudden Shakespeare appears.
Yes.
That just is just more of the mystery of this fascinating literary detective drama that we're involved in.
Yeah, it's a great point. We have a lot of early poems written by the Earl of Oxford that were actually printed, not like a whole book, but in different anthologies. We would find sometimes 5 or 6 poems written by the Earl of Oxford, and he also wrote under other pseudonyms, like a Latin pseudonym. So, if you do some more detective work, you can see before the Shakespeare name came out, he had a lot of very decent poems, often with his name on it, Earl of Oxford, but that's all, And then in 1593, we'd get this poem come out, a very erotic poem called Venus and Adonis. And it's the first time the name William Shakespeare is in print, and it just causes a sensation. The book is reprinted many times, and other writers are imitating it because it was so influential, so wonderful. And I think it must have been very gratifying for him to see this type of reaction to one of his great works, even though he didn't have his actual name on it.
And Catherine, since you just mentioned Venus and Adonis, we have to get into Titian's painting. So if you already mentioned that Edward did travel around the continent, and Shakespeare never left England. Why is this painting so similar to what was written in the this lengthy poem?
Yes, that's another fascinating thing. In Shakespeare's poem, Venus and Adonis, he makes many references to paintings. And yeah, there we go.
Sorry for the cheap special effects, Daryl.
Right. And so the painting that Mark just showed us is called Venus and Adonis, and it's by the artist Titian. Tiziano Vecellio. I don't know exactly how to say his name, but we call him Titian today. And that picture, in the picture that he just showed, we have Adonis wearing a hat. Now, Titian made 5 versions of this painting of Venus and Adonis. The same thing, tiny little details are different. And only one shows him wearing this hat.
Wow.
And that particular painting was only in Titian's studio and was in his studio when he died.
Wow.
That's the fascinating thing. Now, the Earl of Oxford and Titian worked in Venice. He was Venetian. And it's on record that the Earl of Oxford visited Venice. And and for a lengthy time. And Also, there is a record that the Earl of Oxford requested a visit to the Doge's palace, the leader of Venice, his palace, and a particular room. And the reason why he wanted to go in that room is because it was full of paintings, and it was renowned for this. So he definitely had an interest in paintings. So it makes me think for sure that he went to Titian's studio and met him and saw this painting, and this painting perhaps inspired the poem, very likely inspired the poem. Actually, other writers earlier had written poetry based on painting. So it was kind of the thing to do in Italy back then. So that's what's so interesting. And also there was another Titian painting of Lucrece, The Rape of Lucrece, which also happens to be another Shakespeare poem.
Mhm.
So it appears to me that he was influenced, the great author was influenced by Titian's works and described them in his poem.
In your book, you say the publication of Venus and Adonis with a muzzle or alias, an example, William Shakespeare, is the hugest and mightiest miracle of 1593. Queen Elizabeth I was involved or responsible. So Shakespeare identity is linked with Edward de Vere, the 17th Earl of Oxford. Explain that more for me and my listeners.
Yes. In 1593, there was a writer named Gabriel Harvey, and he made that quote that you just mentioned.
Mhm.
And he was associating Venus and Adonis, which had just been published in 1593, right? He was associating that with harness, like a cover. He was saying, he said that he delayed the publication of his own book because of the sensation of Venus and Adonis.
Right.
And he refers to Venus and Adonis as that fair body of the sweetest Venus in print, as it is redoubtably armed with the complete harness of the bravest Minerva. Okay, so he's saying that Venus Adonis is armed like the goddess was armed, Minerva.
Right.
She was armed with a spear and a shield. So it was an indirect reference to Shakespeare. So he was in essence saying that Shakespeare is a pen name. But there's many other contemporary references like that, alluding to the name Shakespeare being a pen name. But
So-
they just, yes, go.
So who were his muses? And I guess when we're asking that, we're taking De Vere into play.
Yes, well, I think that he was writing a lot about the Queen because he knew her, and he was writing about himself. I think he was writing about many of the people he knew and loved. Certainly the sonnets are that. And of course, a great muse, quote unquote, was the young man in the sonnets.
Right.
Because he even wrote in the dedication to Venus and Adonis how much he admired this young man who almost every scholar believes was the Earl of Southampton. So I think that he was definitely one of his muses. I think he was his child, but I think that's what the sonnets tell us.
Really?
About, yes, that the fair youth was actually the great author's child, because he does speak in a fatherly tone. Some may disagree and say that it was homosexual. I don't see it. Yes, that's the Earl of
That's
Southampton.
him, right?
Yes, yes.
Wait, I can't. There we go. That's him.
Yes, he was a beautiful youth. You can see from the painting,
Yeah.
with beautiful eyes, and he was a courtier. So the idea that the Stratford man would have known him is very unlikely. He was one
Exactly.
of the Queen's great favorites, and he hung out in the highest circles. So it's not
And,
likely the two would have met.
and he was spared for participating in the Essex Rebellion.
Yes, he was one of the leaders with Essex. And interestingly, although Essex, the Earl of Essex, was beheaded, the Earl of Southampton was not. He survived, and no one knows why. We don't know why he was spared. I think, and I speculate in my book, that perhaps it was a deal that the Earl of Oxford made as Shakespeare to never reveal his identity as the great author, in exchange for his life, or something along those lines. I mean, we'll never know. It's never going to be written down, but it could be.
Well, that deal he made with he may have made with the Queen, that could go back to the line from Sonnet 66 where he does talk about tongue-tied by authority.
Yes. Yeah, that's a very good point.
Yeah, because he was lucky. In that same situation, Francis Bacon happened to have left that little group, that little circle of friends, like right before all of this stuff happened. And
Right.
that's what saved his
Yeah,
rear end.
and he was later criticized for that. First, he was in the Earl of Essex's camp, and then he abandoned him.
Right, right.
when it all happened.
Right,
So,
right.
yeah, there was definitely a lot of intrigue, and back then you had to do what you could to save your life, because
Exactly.
they could just throw you in the tower
at any
for any
time.
reason.
Any time.
It was dictatorship, really. So
let's talk about the Dark Lady. There were 3 that were up for nominations. And who do you think that Dark Lady was? Because she was considered a muse. She was referred to a couple of times, and I don't see the one that they say is William Shakespeare being at all involved with her. So
no.
tell us about her.
Yes, well, the great author was really obsessed by this lady. And he makes it very clear it's a very strong sexual relationship and attraction that he had for her. And who was she? I think if the Earl of Oxford is a great author, then it had to have been a lady named Anne Vavasor, who was one of the Queen Elizabeth's attendants.
Yeah.
And she was one who we mentioned earlier. He impregnated, and they had a child together. But
she's the one?
She's the one. And the baby was in the tower too, as well as her.
Wow.
Yeah, and you can see her dark hair and dark eyes.
Right.
So it's very likely that she was the Dark Lady. Although even within our movement, there's some controversy of who she really was. I think it's very clear it was her, because there weren't a lot of dark ladies in England back then, but she was one of them.
And you were saying, I didn't want to interrupt, but I just think this is interesting that you believe that the Dark Lady, his mistress, had an affair with the fair youth.
Yes, that's where it gets very juicy. Yes. Yeah, so the great author loved and respected the fair youth, but in the meantime, him and the Dark Lady were having an affair, and he mentions this in the sonnets. So the sonnets are really a good read. I mean, it may take time to get used to, the language, back then. but it's
Yeah.
really very interesting. And, you know, he went to the tower because of her. He was exiled because of her, you know, but I think that he really still loved her. Unfortunately, the queen forced him to go back to his wife.
Mm.
So, you know, but he still would see her. And we know this because members of her family, some men, would have fights in the street with the Earl of Oxford's men. So something was still going on after he went back to his wife. So, and you know, this type of thing recalls Romeo and Juliet, doesn't it?
Yeah, yeah, it does.
Yeah.
I was just thinking that the
Yeah.
Capulets and the Romulans.
Montagues.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, I mean, just in play after play and in the sonnets, you can just see these life parallels with the Earl of Oxford, and it's very compelling. And yeah, this lady, the Anne of Avenzoar, she was something. She, after the Earl of Oxford was kaput with their relationship, she went on to another courtier, and she lived with him. He was married at the time. She had a child by him. I mean, she was really quite a number.
Well,
And
who
yeah.
was the woman at the tavern or the bar? Like, I was reading when I was doing the research of all these people that were brought up that there was another woman that ran a tavern or something like that. That was, you know, some of the camps say it was her, then some say it was this woman we just spoke of, and then others say the queen. So
Yeah, I've heard something like that about the tavern, a lady in a tavern. But I honestly, I don't know about that. I think it's, you know, based on the Stratford man being the great author. So
okay,
I don't know. I don't know that.
okay,
Yeah.
okay, okay. Well, I'm good because I'm more and more on the side of uh De Vere being the one. I just think that's just such a shame that he couldn't come out of the closet and and you know accept the fame that, you know, here it is, we're still doing Shakespeare's plays.
Who
And
else can you say that for 400 years later? I mean, who else, whose plays are being still performed? Just this guy. So, and he knew it. If you know, read the sonnets, he knows it. He knows his works are going to live forever. But he also, at the same breath, knew that his name would not survive them. So it appears he knew this was going to happen.
yeah,
But my guess is he thought that the pen name would live on. I don't think he anticipated them putting the Stratford man in his place. I think that really was diabolical. That was really
right,
unfair. Yeah.
right,
If they didn't put that face in the folio, which is not a portrait of the Earl of Oxford, we don't know who it is or what it is. I think that over time, people would have accepted that this name was a pen name. But because there was a face and a monument in Stratford-on-Avon, that was it. It was enough. And posterity just hasn't looked back. But like you say, it really gets you.
yeah, it does.
You want the great author to get the credit. And even
Yeah,
writers of the period felt that way too after he died. There's a couple examples in my book where, you know, let the world know. If you don't let the world know now, he will be lost to obscurity. And they were right.
yeah,
They were right.
yeah, that's
That's
it.
what I try to, you know, point out in the book, because these references are rarely noted in traditional Shakespeare biographies. They just ignore them.
And
They
then
don't.
too, you were saying like in that time when someone of importance died or whatever, the writers of the time or the poets of the time would, you know, like write something in honor of that particular person and their passing or something. And there's nothing from William
Yes.
Shakespeare.
Like, for example, when Ben Jonson died, he was a famous, very famous playwright. He lived after Shakespeare. When he died, there were at least 2 or 3 books filled with poems by many different people in
Mhm.
tribute to Ben Jonson.
Right.
Where's the same thing for the great author Shakespeare? Nothing. And interestingly, when the Earl of Oxford died in 1604, nobody said a word too, which is very curious. Everyone was afraid to say anything about him. I mean, even there were several people that he had patronized books, these authors. Some of these authors were still alive when the
Right.
Earl of Oxford died. They should have written something like, my former patron has died. I'm sorry.
Right.
God rest his soul or something. They didn't even do that much. Forgetting about him saying he's Shakespeare, they just didn't say a word. And that's what makes me think that it was something political too
Yeah.
that was going on. But
Yeah.
a few authors, would make reference to his death. Like, for example, in 1607, William Barkstead wrote a book, and the very last lines was a tribute to Shakespeare.
Mhm.
And in it, he called, in essence, he said Shakespeare was the neighbor of the muses. Like you mentioned, the muses.
Right.
They were the Greek goddesses of the arts. They were immortal, right? So
Mhm.
when you're saying that Shakespeare is now the neighbor of a muse, he's saying that Shakespeare is immortal, that meaning he's dead.
Yeah.
Now, in 1607, the Stratford man was still alive, but the Earl of Oxford had died just 3 years previously.
Yeah.
And then we've been talking about the sonnets. In 1609, when the sonnets came out, there is a dedication on it written by the publisher. And he refers to Shakespeare as our ever-living poet, our ever-living poet. That's another giveaway that the great author is dead. I mean, that's a term you use for someone who has passed away. And yet again, the Stratford man was alive.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah.
There were clues that were dropped, but Shakespeare professors today, they don't seem to recognize any of this.
No, not today.
Not today. Yeah.
But I think that it was recognized back then. I think that whole literary circle and actors and they all knew.
Yes, in fact, even royalty knew. In 1605, their play season for the royals, for Christmas time, they would have plays. And there was like 6 or 7 Shakespeare plays performed before the new king. So, and the Earl of Oxford died in 1604. So maybe it was a tribute.
Yeah. I believe it was, and for whatever reason,
Yes.
you just can't really put your finger on the reason. Because other than the plays, who would be thinking about De Vere?
Right. So, and also when De Vere's wife died in 1612, a few years later, they had more Shakespeare plays. So it's interesting. And of course, during both these dates, the Stratford man was alive. Why wasn't the Stratford man given? Why don't we have an anecdote or a record of him being there when this tremendous compliment to the great author was happening? 5 or 6 Shakespeare plays and performed before royalty. I mean, that was a great honor. But there's no record of him being there. So, yeah, it's just, to me, it's so obvious. And it's time for, everyone to look into it.
Yeah, and rectify history.
Yes.
give the person his dues, because I'm pissed off about it, for real. It just really has an effect on me that this almost seems this almost seems like a Shakespearean play.
It is. It is.
It really does. It reads like a Shakespearean play.
I know, and I think we're in Act 5 right now. I think we're getting close to resolution, and we'll see how it plays out. I hope it ends well. But we speak his words today, and we don't even know it. He
I do.
invented about 2,000 words for the English language.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
so many phrases like foregone conclusion, or it's Greek to me. These are straight out of Hamlet.
Yeah.
And so many other plays.
And I still recite, from my college days and high school days, because several plays were near and dear to my heart. I just wish I were a man that I could play the lead in Macbeth or Hamlet, because he wrote some darn good
and
males roles.
and controversial.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yes, like Othello.
Yeah. Yeah.
Showing interracial marriage. I mean, who did that back then?
Yeah.
And what about in Merchant of Venice? Talking about a Jew being discriminated against,
Right.
and vice versa.
Right.
And what about showing Portia as a lawyer? I mean, a woman dressed as a man, acting as a lawyer and succeeding.
Yeah.
for her case. I mean, all of these roles were
Social
really
issues.
advanced
Yeah.
for this time. And he really was quite a personality. And you read about the Earl of Oxford's life, and you can see it. It makes sense. It's a perfect match.
Yeah. Yeah. So
And
tell us about the Shakespeare Oxford Fellowship Conference in October that's coming up.
yes. October 8th and 9th, we're going to have a video conference and several speakers. I'm one of them, and it's free. Anyone can go to ShakespeareOxfordFellowship.org and register, and you can be among the many who are going to watch. And I'm going to give a paper about a painting that I think is the Earl of Oxford's sister, Mary. And so that I'm going to give my evidence for that.
Oh, wow.
And I think there's a lot of other portraits of Oxford out there, and I've kind of been on the lookout for new pictures. And like, for example, the one on my book, I think I found it and attributed to the Earl of Oxford. And I think that once we start seeing more of these images of him, people are going to get more excited and want to know more about him.
Right.
And his family.
Right.
We're still looking for one of his father, but I'll find it at some point.
Wow. A point that I thought was really interesting in similarities. Neither one really had descendants. There's no descendants of either one.
That's a good point. The Stratford man, his family died out with his granddaughter.
Right.
And she lived as late as 1670. And the plays, of course, were already renowned, famous. He was a great figure, Shakespeare. But nobody went to the granddaughter and asked her, "Tell us about your famous grandfather."
Exactly. Exactly.
And besides that, the Stratford man's daughters were illiterate, which just totally boggles the mind. How could the greatest author in the universe at the time not allow his daughters to write? And yet you have very literate women in the plays, all the plays.
God, and I was looking at at the Stratford one's handwriting, and it just was atrocious. You know, I mean, like, how could anybody even read the?
You can't. All we have are these six signatures, and 3 were on his will, and the other 3 were on, legal documents, and they're all formed differently, and there's controversy is as if he even wrote them at all. So if we don't even have those signatures, then we have 0 in his handwriting.
Yeah, so how does the world's greatest writer not be able to write his name the same way 3 times on 3 separate sheets of paper on the same day?
Yes. Yes. And also our organization puts out a yearly journal, and it just came out, and it's called The Oxfordian. And I also have an article in there about the parallels between Lord Prospero in The Tempest and a living figure of the time. His name was Prospero Visconti, an Italian man. And it's very possible that the Earl of Oxford met this man and learned about his story when he visited Milan. Milan. So everywhere you want to look with the Earl of Oxford, you can find these parallels.
Right.
And I think that the true research is being done. The Shakespeare research is being advanced with Oxfordian literature, and really the Shakespeare orthodoxy, they pretty much haven't had anything new for 100 years about the Stratford man, which really tells you something.
Yeah,
it does. Go ahead, Mark.
Well, I was going to say, since Catherine was just talking about if De Vere was in Milan in what, the 1570s or so, possibly met Titian in Venice. All these dates are what 15, 20 years prior to the traditional biography of Shakespeare writing, getting started in his career. So with this difference, and we could also talk about Ramon's Ireland incident in Henry V on your pages 48 through 49. With that, somewhere around a 15 to 20 year difference between De Vere and Shakespeare, that does call into question for us to reevaluate the dates of the plays when Shakespeare was supposedly writing all these plays.
Well, yeah, I mean, the example you're talking about is, we're now the general of our gracious empress, as in good time he may, from Ireland coming, bringing rebellion broached on his sword. This is from Henry V, rebellion broached on his sword. So many people believe this is a reference to the Earl of Essex, who was sent to Ireland to, control the Irish and have, in war or what have you. And it doesn't quite fit, actually, the Earl of Essex, because he had a colossal failure there. He came back in disgrace. you know, he just ran back to the Queen when he wasn't even told to come back. So he really got in trouble for that. But around 15 years earlier, there was another Earl who was sent to Ireland, the Earl of Desmond. And he successfully put down a rebellion there in Ireland. And he brought the head back
Whoa.
on a sword and gave it to Queen Elizabeth. And, you know, that perfectly describes rebellion broached on a sword. And this was discovered by Ramon Jimenez, who recently wrote a book too. And yeah, I mean, it's perfect. It fits perfectly, but it doesn't fit for 1599. It fits for the 1580s. So again, this is another interesting historical reference in the works, in the plays.
I'm looking. There are so many similarities of the Earl of Oxford to things in the plays. And the Merchant of Venice, the
Yes.
3,000 ducats, and how, you know, in the play, Antonio the Merchant, he borrows 3,000 from Shylock, and he helped finances Bassanio's wooing of Portia. And in real life, Oxford borrowed 3,000 pounds from a money lender named Michael Locke,
Yes.
Sherlock Locke, to finance a voyage seeking the Northwest Passage to India. And it just, I mean, come on.
And he lost it.
And he lost it.
And that accounts for Hamlet's line, "I am but mad northwest."
Yeah.
It makes sense
Yeah.
why he was
Yeah.
mad.
Yeah.
He lost a fortune, you know, and 1,000 pounds like back then was like $1 million. So, you know, he lost quite a bit. Yes. Yeah, but it's again a perfect parallel. And even in like All's Well That Ends Well, the character Bertram, it starts out and Bertram has become a ward of the king because his father has died and he is a nobleman, right? So that's what happened in the 16th century. If you were a nobleman and you have a young child and you die, and the young child now no longer is the custody of the mother, it's the monarch.
Right.
For whatever their reasons were back then. Well, that exactly happened with the Earl of Oxford. When he was 12, his father died, and he became a ward of the Queen, Queen Elizabeth. And she appointed Lord Burleigh, who was her minister, to be his guardian. So it's a perfect parallel with All's Well That Ends Well.
Yes.
He wrote about what he knew. He wrote his life experiences. And it comes alive when you have this biography. You read the plays, you read the sonnets. I get it. You can suddenly get it. You can get the motivation.
Yeah. And like the 3 daughters that he had, just as King Lear did.
Yes.
You know? And King Lear divided his kingdom among his daughters while he still lived. And Oxford placed his family land in trust for the benefits of his daughters while he lived. I mean, there's just, you know, it's like the puzzle is coming together. Now, my
all the pieces fit. Yeah.
In your journey, have you ever gotten any feedback, negative feedback from the royal family in England regarding this? Like, would they tell you, no, just stop, you know, because it's been so hush hush all this time and now it's coming to light? Have you or heard of any resistance from the royal family during all of this?
I haven't. But interestingly, Prince Philip, who recently died, he was known to be an authorship doubter. So
Ah,
yeah, I mean, he was a controversial figure in other things, but he also saw some merit to this argument.
wow.
So I don't know about Prince Charles or the other ones, and of course, no, I have not had contact with him. Although I did meet Prince Charles once
Oh.
at
Because
a
I'm thinking they would know. I mean, it seems like it would be something that was passed down like a secret, or you know, yeah,
I
we know who
wonder.
he is, you know,
Maybe they do know. Maybe they have some manuscripts that we don't know about. You know, who
or
knows?
the Vatican, you know, they
Oh yeah,
they might have some. They all of his stuff is might be sitting in there down in the basement, you
yeah.
know,
They have they call it secret archives.
right?
But
Of everything,
yes,
anything
yes.
of importance they have.
I
Because I cannot fathom that there is nothing,
I know that nobody said
nothing.
anything, not even in a private letter. I don't know. It could be in Europe. You're right. I think there's a good chance it's in Europe. Because there are very few Oxfordians, right? And even less are doing research. So, you know, if we get the world to accept this notion, then there's going to be all sorts of research going on
Right.
all over the world, and they may come up with things. That's what I'm hoping anyway.
Yeah.
To
Yeah.
really have smoking gun proof. Right now, we just have a pile of circumstantial evidence in our favor.
Yeah.
Of course, the Stratford man has nothing. All he has
Mm.
is after he died evidence. He doesn't have lifetime evidence like the Earl of Oxford. So I'm hoping one day it may, you know, something might be found, but we have to start looking in the right direction,
That's
right?
right. And you have to get it out there, because I mean, when Mark told me about you, I remember hearing, you know, the doubt back in, I think, the end of the 80s, that there was commotion going on.
Yeah, there was
But
this great documentary. Yes.
and then of course the movie Shakespeare in Love, and there was another movie, and you know, when you see things like that, you go to research, but it wasn't fulfilling what you found. You
Yes.
know, it just was empty.
Well, you know, lately there's another organization called the Shakespeare Authorship Coalition. They're at doubtaboutwill.org. That's a great place for your listeners to go to. You can read about the authorship there, and they put together a declaration of reasonable doubt. So you
Wow.
can read this declaration and you can sign it too. And you can see who else has signed it. People who say, yes, it is reasonable to doubt that the Stratford man is the great author. And you can see all the famous people in the past who doubted as well. And they put out a few years ago, they put out a reward of £40,000 and they directed it to the Shakespeare Birthplace Trust in England, saying, we'll give you this amount of money if you can, in essence, prove the Stratford man was the great author. And they did. They didn't accept the challenge, which is
Really?
very telling. You know?
Wow. So
I
that's
mean,
doubtaboutwill.org.
yes,
Yeah, I'm putting it in
doubtaboutwill.org.
the chat.
Yes, and I encourage your listeners to go there, read the declaration, and it really sums up the case very well. And if you like to be one of the signatories,
Yeah.
and
Yeah,
yeah,
because I mean, it's like this mystery, like who done it, but you know, there's who did it, and why, because like I said, I started reading your book, and every time I come across a name or a situation, then I Google in, and then you get so wrapped up because their lives are fascinating.
Yes.
And you just keep going down, down, and I'm like, gosh, how did she ever even be able to write? Because one road leads you to another road, leads you
Totally.
to another road, and
Totally.
oh my God! But it was fun.
That's
Was
why
fun.
it took me about 7 years to write the book.
Yeah,
So,
because wow, wow, it's just God. I can't wait to see. Well, I hope in my lifetime that I find out what the conclusion to all of this
yes,
is.
me too, me too. And the other interesting thing about this declaration is, instead of the Shakespeare Trust accepting the reward and proving their case for the Stratford man, instead, they ignored it, said no, and then they wrote a book called Shakespeare Beyond Doubt. And they got a lot of scholars together, and they tried to prove, that there's nothing wrong with the Stratford man is the great, everything's fine, and it wasn't that great, wasn't that convincing in my opinion. And so then this Dad About Will organization shot back with a book called Shakespeare Beyond Doubt with a question mark. So it's been a back and forth. So we'll see what happens in the future.
We shall see.
Yeah.
So, okay, tell them once again about the conference coming up in October, because we want to push that on them, and everybody out there listening. It is going to be on Zoom, right?
Yes. Yes, but you have to register. So
Yeah.
you go to ShakespeareOxfordFellowship.org, and it mentions the conference, and then you click on that, and they give you directions
Yeah.
how to get on. And it's a 2-day conference. It starts, I believe, the 8th, later in the afternoon, and then all day on Saturday the 9th. And
Okay.
I'm one of several speakers, and with a variety of topics. And I encourage anyone who's interested in this topic to take a look.
Wow.
And maybe
Yeah,
become
all
a
you
member.
thespians out there, get the thespians up, get them riled up, demand the truth,
Well, a prominent actor is Mark Rylance, Sir Mark Rylance in England. And
Yeah.
he's a big doubter, Shakespeare doubter. And Michael York
Yeah.
is a well-known actor. He's an Oxfordian. And Sir John Gielgud, he too was a Shakespeare doubter.
Yeah.
So there's been some very prominent
Well,
English actors. Yes.
Catherine, and Sir Derek Jacobi highly praised your book.
Yes.
I saw
forgot to
that.
mention.
Yeah. So
Yeah.
he's one too then.
And he was
Yes.
in Anonymous as what, we might as well plug that movie.
Yes, in 2011, the motion picture Anonymous, he was in that. And that
Right.
shows the Earl of Oxford as Shakespeare,
Right.
and
right.
it shows the Stratford man. I think the guy who did the Stratford man was great. It shows him as a separate person. And so that, other parts of the movie may have been a little hard to follow, but it was the very first time to see the Earl of Oxford who, as he really was, the true Shakespeare. And that was very fascinating and very exciting for someone like me.
And every actor, that's why I said if the actors got together, and raise a little bit of hell, it might move things on fast, because every actor, me included, had to cut your teeth on Shakespeare.
Yes.
And that was your goal, to get to play some part in live theater from one of the plays. So you guys out there, you need to stand up and be heard and demand some answers, and go to the Shakespeare fellowship.org and check it out. And Mark, do you have anything else you want to add or bring up?
Well, there's the Oxfordian volume 23. The researchers presented some great
Yes.
chapters in that book. This topic isn't just people looking for clues in the plays or sonnets. Your colleagues are looking at various aspects of the whole Elizabethan time period, and like the Boccaccio's Decameron. That was a really interesting chapter. The author was discussing how that Italian novel from the 14th century, it was really had a profound influence on the development of the English novel, but was De Vere involved in translating it? That your group is looking onto the continent as well for to put together more information. I was really impressed with that publication. And something else that Catherine, from your book, that gives us more information about the traditional biography doesn't add up, is how do you have this country bumpkin kind of character who has no education that we can really document, and he's cranking out over what his 20-year writing career, about 40 plays. So that's writing a world masterpiece every 6 months. How is that accomplished? Like Stephen King doesn't even do that.
Yes, well, they're very constricted with the Stratford man's career, because, as I mentioned earlier, like the first definite reference we have to him and the theater was he was 30 years old in 1595. So that's about when they have to work a little further back when he started his career, and then they have to fit all these masterpieces in a maybe 25-year period, something like that. But if they would broaden their horizons and say, hey, maybe it's not this guy, you can see that it spanned many decades, that probably the Earl of Oxford started in his early teens, maybe even earlier. I think that Romeo and Juliet may have been a very early play, because in 1562, when he was 12, we have this poem called Romeus and Juliet. And in the opening of Romeus and Juliet, it is written by a guy named Arthur Brooke. And in it, he says that he was inspired by seeing a recent drama of this wow. topic. Wow. So I think the recent drama that he saw probably was a Shakespeare play, probably a very early version of it, probably maybe not as long as the one we have today. But this gives you hints and clues, and there's a lot of these out there. So it's very gratifying to search them out, and you can do it with the Earl of Oxford, and it just fits like a glove.
Wow.
Well, Catherine, I think what you said about an hour ago, is if you look at the fair youth from the sonnets as Oxford's son, there we go. What you said about the everything fits like a glove. Things really start, the whole story comes together when you look at it that way.
Yes. You have in the first 17 sonnets, the great author is imploring the fair youth to get married and have children and continue the line, For the Stratford man to be the one saying that to the Earl of Southampton, who almost everybody, even the Shakespeare scholars, believe was the fair youth. I mean, it's totally illogical. You can't tell a nobleman to do anything if you're someone of no status, which was the case for the
Right.
Stratford man. So, again, it points to me, if he was his father, he had to have been a nobleman as well. So it fits perfectly. And that's the beauty of Oxfordian studies. If you have a theory, all you have to do is look at the Earl of Oxford's life and you can find hints of it, and it'll come alive. Just like for my paper in the Oxfordian, it was an art historian who found the reference to Prospero Visconti as being someone who was the model for Lord Prospero in The Tempest, the magician, Lord Prospero. And I just found that article and I looked at it closer, and yes, Prospero Visconti, he was in Milan. The Earl of Oxford almost certainly went to Milan. His letters imply it, letters by other people of the period imply it. He was somebody who had a great library. The Earl of Oxford was deeply interested in academic studies. He would want to meet him. So, the man who first made this proposition didn't know about the Earl of Oxford. I did, so I was able to further his research. And that's the beauty of it all.
Wow. Wow.
And there's the birthplace that's a major tourist attraction. But do places like Hedingham Castle, where De Vere grew up, and maybe any of the other places associated with like Burley House, is there any type of tour guide that maybe kind of whispers, like the real author was born here or lived part of his life here?
You mean Castle Hedingham?
Yes.
The town. I think the town is definitely aware. Hedingham Castle is the birthplace of the Earl of Oxford, and they acknowledge that he could be the true Shakespeare. And the town even knows it too. There's a tiny, small little village. They're certainly aware of it. But yeah, have they any sort of anecdotes or rumors? I couldn't tell you. I don't know. But it's a very sweet town. I've been there.
Wow. Any more questions, Mark?
No, oh, sure. I have a lot more questions, but I know we're also running out of time. So I'll just be quiet and let you two wrap up.
Catherine, I have thoroughly enjoyed this. Oh my gosh.
I'm so
Thank you
pleased.
so much. And everybody, if I can get this to here's the book. And I posted the link in the chat where you can buy this book on Amazon
Yes.
and check out the conference on Zoom. You don't even have to leave home, but you do have to register early. And so I just want to ask this question. Will the real William Shakespeare please stand up? And with that, you guys, thank you for joining me, and Mark and Catherine and Daryl. And I want to say good night.
Good night.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Take me home, Daryl.
And you are clear. Very good. That was a dynamite show.
Wow.
Right. You kept me logged in on what you were doing. That's a dynamite show. Hold on, let me grab Reverend Ed wherever he is, somewhere in here. He's got to pop in. Okay, where is he? All right.
He said he's coming on. See y'all soon.
Yeah. All right. But that was a dynamite show. Okay, hop in. Oh, come